Students, haloalkanes and haloarenes. What are haloalkanes? Hydrocarbons which consist of halogen as the functional group are known as haloalkanes. Hydrocarbons like alkane, alkene, alkyne, benzene. Hydrocarbons which consist of halogen as the functional group are known as haloalkanes and haloarenes. Example, R single bond H, which is known as alkane, which consists of a halogen as the functional group, which is known as a haloalkane. Then haloarene, which consists of a halogen as the functional group, is known as a haloarene. These are haloalkanes. Example, alkyl halide, ఇవి తీసుకున్నాం example. Next, what about the classification of haloalkanes? On the basis of halogen atoms, these can be classified into several types. On the basis of halogen atoms, haloalkanes are mainly classified into three types. There are monohalogen derivatives, dihalogen derivatives, polyhalogen derivatives. On the basis of the number of halogen atoms, haloalkanes are mainly classified into three types: monohalogen derivative, dihalogen derivative, and polyhalogen derivative. Monohalogen derivatives consist of only one halogen atom. Dihalogen derivatives consist of two halogen atoms. Polyhalogen derivatives means which consist of more than two halogen atoms. More than two halogen atoms consist of 3, 4, 5. Next, monohaloalkanes example, CH3, CH2, X తీసుకున్నాం, CH3, CH2, Cl example, chloroethane. Dihaloalkane consists of two halogen atoms which consist of two halogens. Polyhalogen derivatives consist of three halogen atoms, minimum three, which consist of two or more than two halogen derivatives, CH2X. Monohalogen derivative, monohalogen derivative, dihalogen derivative, and polyhalogen derivative. The general formula of monohalogen derivatives is CnH2n plus 1x. That is the general formula of monohalogen derivatives. Monohalogen derivatives consist of only one halogen atom. Monohalogen derivatives which consist of only one halogen atom. General formula of monohalogen derivative is CnH2n plus 1x. X is a halogen like fluorine, chlorine, bromine, and iodine. General example is CH3, CH2, Cl, which is known as ethyl chloride, monohalogen derivative. Then on the basis of the position of monohalogen derivative, position of halogen, monohalogen derivatives are again classified into three types. There are primary monohalogen derivative, secondary monohalogen derivative, and tertiary monohalogen derivative. On the basis of the position of halogen, these can be classified into three types: primary monohalogen derivative, secondary monohalogen derivative, and tertiary monohalogen derivative. In primary monohalogen derivative, halogen is with primary carbon. In secondary monohalogen derivative, halogen is with secondary carbon. In tertiary halogen derivative, halogen is with tertiary carbon. Halogen with primary carbon, secondary carbon, and tertiary carbon. Monohalogen derivative consists of halogen on primary carbon. In secondary halogen derivative, halogen is present on second carbon. In tertiary monohalogen derivative, halogen is with the tertiary carbon. For example, primary monohalogen derivative, halogen is with the primary carbon. This is primary carbon. Carbon with one carbon is known as primary carbon. Carbon with another two carbon atoms is known as secondary carbon. Carbon with another three carbon atoms is known as a tertiary carbon. This is primary monohalogen derivative. Then in secondary monohalogen derivative, halogen is with a secondary carbon. Secondary carbon means which with carbon with another two carbon atoms. This carbon is the secondary carbon. This carbon bonds with another two carbon atoms. This is also a secondary carbon. This is a primary carbon, and this is primary carbon. Tertiary monohalogen derivative, then a halogen is with a tertiary carbon. This carbon is the tertiary carbon. Carbon with a halogen with a tertiary carbon. Carbon with another three carbon atoms. Primary carbon, secondary carbon, tertiary carbon. Primary monohalogen derivative, secondary monohalogen derivative, and a tertiary monohalogen derivative. So on the basis of the position of a halogen, these monohalogen derivatives are classified into three types. They are primary monohalogen derivative, secondary monohalogen derivative, and a tertiary monohalogen derivative. Halogen with a primary carbon in primary monohalogen derivative. Halogen with a secondary carbon in secondary monohalogen derivative. Halogen with a tertiary carbon in tertiary monohalogen derivative. This is the classification of monohalogen derivatives. Then on the basis of the nature of bonding and hybridization, these can be classified into several types. There are alkyl halide, alkyl halide, allyl halide, vinyl halide, vinyl halide. Alkyl halide, halogen is with sp3 carbon, that is alkyl halide. Allyl halide, halogen with sp3 carbon, and that sp3 carbon bonds with the sp2 carbon. Vinyl halide, halogen with sp2 carbon. So if halogen bonds with the sp3 carbon, that is known as alkyl halide. If halogen bonds with the sp3 carbon and that sp3 carbon bonds with the sp2 carbon, that is known as allyl halide. Vinyl alkyl halide, example CH3, CH2, 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 Cl. This carbon is sp3 carbon. Carbon with a single bond is known as sp3 hybridized carbon. Carbon with a double bond is known as sp2 hybridized carbon. Carbon with a triple bond is known as sp hybridized carbon. Carbon with both side double bond is known as sp hybridized carbon. sp3 carbon, sp2 carbon, sp carbon, and sp carbon. If a functional group is with the sp3 carbon, that is known as alkyl. Halogen with sp3 carbon, so this is known as alkyl halide. Then another example, CH2 double bond CHCl. Halogen with the sp2 carbon, so this is known as vinyl halide. Double bonded carbon is known as sp2 hybridized carbon, and the functional group is with the sp2 hybridized carbon, so this is known as vinyl halide. Then another example, CH2 double bond CH single bond CH2Cl. Halogen with the sp3 carbon, and this sp3 carbon is with sp2 hybridized carbon, sp3 with the sp2 hybridized carbon, so this is known as allyl halide. So halogen with sp3 carbon is known as alkyl halide. Halogen with sp3 carbon and that sp3 carbon with sp2 hybridized carbon is known as allyl halide. Halogen with sp2 hybridized carbon is known as vinyl halide. Next, aryl halide. Aryl halide. Halogen with sp2 of benzene. Halogen with sp2 of benzene is known as aryl halide. So this carbon is sp2 hybridized carbon. So halogen with sp2 hybridized carbon is known as aryl halide. Next, benzoylic halide. Another type, benzoylic halide. Halogen with sp3 carbon, and that sp3 carbon bonds with the sp2 carbon of benzene. So if a halogen is with sp3 carbon and that sp3 carbon bonds with the sp2 carbon of a benzene, that is known as a benzoylic halide. So this is aryl halide and this is a benzoylic halide. So halogen with sp3 carbon is alkyl halide. Halogen with sp2 carbon is known as vinyl halide. Halogen with sp3 carbon and sp3 carbon with sp2 carbon is known as allyl halide. Halogen with benzene carbon is known as aryl halide. Halogen with sp3 hybridized carbon which is with the benzene group is known as benzoylic halide. This is the classification of alkyl halides on the basis of the nature of bonding and hybridization. Next, classification of dihalides. Dihalides consist of two halogen atoms. Dihalides are classified into three types. One is geminal dihalide, which is known as gem dihalide. Another one is vicinal dihalide, which is known as vicinal dihalide. And third one is terminal dihalide. So dihalides are mainly classified into three types. They are geminal dihalide, vicinal dihalide and terminal dihalide. In geminal dihalide, both the halogens are attached to same carbon. Example, ethylidene chloride, CH3, CHCl2. Both the halogen atoms are bound with the same carbon. That is known as a geminal dihalide. Then in vicinal dihalide, halogen atoms are attached to adjacent carbon atoms. For example, ethylene chloride. Both the halogen atoms are with the adjacent carbon atoms. That is known as a vicinal dihalide. Then terminal dihalide, then halogens with the terminal carbons. This is a terminal dihalide. Halogens with the terminal carbon is known as a terminal dihalide. So this is the classification of dihalides. So on the basis of the position, this can be classified into three types. Geminal dihalide, halogens with the same carbon. Vicinal dihalide, halogens with the different carbon atoms. Terminal dihalide, halogens with the different carbon